Hi guys, welcome to this video on the Pultec style EQ. It's a legendary EQ. I'm sure if you found this video, you've already heard of it. The original Pultec EQ being a device looking like this. Very rare now, quite sought after, hard to get, ranging from 3,000 to 5,000, maybe even 8,000 in mint condition. This was a influential and industry-changing EQ that came out in, I think, 1951, in the 50s. And engineers soon discovered it had great uses because of the way it affected an EQ curve or the way it changed a sound envelope. Basically because you had a different set of controls. If we look here, we've got boost and attenuation over a low frequency setting of 20, 30, 60 and 100 Hertz. And then we have a high frequency setting between 3 kilohertz and 16 kilohertz here, and also boosting and attenuation. And what happened, a technique that was discovered, was when you boosted and attenuated by the same amount, for example 6 decibels on both controls at a low frequency of say 30, you would, because of the overlapping boosting and attenuating, you would create this interesting contour, and it was known as the low end trick. And that's quite often a technique used for fattening up drums, because it can sort of boost to around about 80 Hertz, which can be desirable in the drums, and then it creates a decrease around 200 Hertz. Now the thing about this EQ is that it is, when you adjust it, you generally go in just using your ears, and that can be fantastic. So you're not relying on what we do these days, a graphical parametric style EQ where we see what we're doing. You go in with your ears, and it does affect the curve in a very odd way, and I think that's why it's become such a legend. It does things that you wouldn't perhaps normally do with a standard parametric EQ. So I haven't got the original Pultec, but I've got a equally as good replica. There are hundreds of replicas now, because it was such a famous EQ. I've got a Tegeler audio manufacturer classic equalizer EQP-1, made here in Germany. It's great because it's left and right channels, so stereo if you like, but they're not linked, so you can process two mono signals or stereo. As the original, of course, was just the one channel, and you would need two of them to do what this Tegeler is doing. There are many other replicas out there, and of course that's why we're doing this video. There are also many software replicas, so I'll go ahead and close that now. I just wanted to show you the original. We can't discuss this review, this comparison, without looking at the original. And in the project here, I've got just an audio sample. I'm only going to use one audio sample to demonstrate. I could have chosen a whole bunch of different audio samples, rock and classic and all sorts, to show you how versatile this Pultec style EQ can be and some of the tricks. But in order to hear the comparison between the hardware and the software, I've chosen just one sample where I think Pultec is particularly useful. And that is a sample that, when you listen to it, let's have a quick listen now. Now, if you listen to that, the first thing it says to me is that the bottom end doesn't have that power, that impact that you need in electronic music and dance music. The drum should really punch. And straight away what comes to my mind, is we can use a Pultec, because it's so versatile over that low end, and it's particularly useful with the low end control and also the high end. So I chose this track because I feel there's, on the cymbal, around 10 kilohertz or something, it's a little bit too harsh, too vibrant, and it can really use some low-end depth or boosting, if you like. It's a track from an Australian producer called Braden Zerkler, and I'm using it for these demonstration purposes. So in my project, I've got a channel set up on this audio sample with, we've got a gain control plugin just to reduce a little bit the gain, because as we adjust our controls of the Pultec EQs, we are going to add a lot of level. So I've just taken that down a little bit because it's quite close to the top here, quite hot. And I've also put this lovely invisible limiter by AOM on the end of the chain, just so that we don't clip and you don't hear anything nasty in your headphones. We're going to go at minus 0.1 dB output, just so we're safe. So that's just explaining the project. We've got our hardware routing, which is going through the EQP-1, and we're converting our AD with a Lynx Hilo mastering grade converter. So also important when you use hardware. And let's have a look what plugins we've got. We've got the Waves puig-tec EQP-1A. I've included Waves because just about everybody uses Waves plugins, and they're very well known, very capable plugins. So it'd be silly not to include Waves, their version. I've also included another great one, Softube. They're doing excellent software. The PE1C. And then last but not least, from the software replica, is the PSP Noble Q. Now PSP is well known for their vintage warmer and things like this. Excellent plugins. And with this replica we get a few more controls. They basically have exactly the same controls as the hardware: the boost and attenuation, the low frequency setting, the bandwidth, the high frequency setting, the boost and attenuation, and this attenuation selector. So they all have this. The PSP has a few more controls. So first thing I'm going to do is just play the audio and tune the hardware to what I think's necessary and discuss as I go through it. So I'll put the hardware on now, and you can watch on the video as I adjust. Get these out of the way. Just play that audio and tune it as best as possible to make that low end a bit better and the high end also more palatable. Okay, so turning it on. Let's start at 20 Hz with the low frequency, and then we'll boost both. I'll go quite severe so you can hear it. 30 Hz. 60, maybe a little bit of attenuation combined. A little bit extreme. Bypass. So you can already hear how that's adding some oomph, some impact, some punch. Really try and focus on those low-end sounds and how the spatial relations of all of the low-end elements are through the hardware. And then later we're going to compare that with the software. Bypass. Back on. Okay, try 100. Okay, so for the low band, I think that's pretty much where I like it. We're going about 5.5 decibels boost, 0 attenuation there, and we're at the 60 Hertz low frequency setting. Now the bandwidth only affects the high frequency selection. And so let's go ahead now and maybe try and reduce some of that high-end harshness or shrillness, if you like. Huge reduction there at 20, that sounds terrible. What about just a little bit? Not bad. But yeah, 10 kilohertz is where that harshness is. 5. Now we could, for example, boost 20 kilohertz. You can hear with the hardware that lovely sheen you can get. So even at 20 kilohertz there, we're adding 6 dB and it still sounds musical. 12 kilohertz. Let's try the bandwidth setting now. Just changing the severity or resonance slightly. We can hear that it's a bit more mild with a bit higher bandwidth setting. So bring that down now. Now, I really like what it's doing around the 3 kilohertz range when I set that to 3, and a little bit less severe. I always like to have more severe boost to hear what's happening, and then I've come down a bit. So I'll bypass again. That's on, and we bypass. So you're getting some real depth there to the sound. So that's basically using my ears. That's how I've tuned the hardware. And in the essence of saving some time, I've gone ahead and put those settings exactly the same on the plugins that we have to demo. So if we look at the boost is around, yes, 4.3. I decided were the best settings, about there. The attenuation is set to 0. The frequency is set to 60. The bandwidth is set to around about 4. The high frequency boost is set to around about 5.5. I'm just going to change that on the hardware as well to match exactly, because I did do this test before using my ears to best tell. And the high frequency is set to 3, correct. And then the 10 kilohertz attenuation is about 2.5. So I've set that on all of them, as you can see, same settings. So let's just have a little listen, bypassing between the hardware and these 3 replicas. So first of all, hardware. Let's try now, bypass the hardware and the waves. Let's try the Softube. Let's try Noble Q. And back to the hardware. And so, I don't know about you, but I noticed instantly that none of the plugins had anywhere near as much oomph in the low end, and they weren't really doing anywhere near the same thing. Now, in order to understand what's happening more, what I've done is I've set up the Waves Q clone here in the project. And what we can do with this, by using Q capture, I'm just going to bypass everything so that we don't affect what we're doing here. By using Q capture, we can send out a blip, and I'll let you hear that very quickly. It's somewhat of an undesirable sound. That's a frequency sweep that's going through to do our EQ modeling. If you haven't heard of Q-Clone yet, its basic idea is to model hardware by feeding a signal through it, routing it through, and capturing the EQ curve. But we can also use it on plugins and really get an idea for how we are affecting the frequency curve, the EQ curve of the audio. And this is a much better way to get a more accurate comparison of what the plugins and the hardware are doing. So I'm in capture mode now, and if I put my EQP-1 from Tegeler on, I can see immediately that that's the curve that it's making, right? Quite interesting. Straight away, I can see that I'm getting a fairly extreme, even though we've only set our setting on the boost to 4.5 or 4 dB or so. I'm getting nearly 8 decibels boost here at around 48 hertz. So that's that punch that I'm enjoying. Then there's a nice slow rolled off downward dip, if you like, with a dip around about 450, 500, which can often be a muddy area in the sound, so it's no wonder I've chosen that. Then there's a little bit of a bump, giving us some presence, if you like, and that's at around 3 to 4 kilohertz. And then we've reduced some of that shrill, that harshness in the 10K range. So that's all evident there when I look at that. But what's great is I can now move these controls. For example, if I wanted to see how the bandwidth affects the overall curve, I can increase both bandwidth settings and see that the higher bandwidth flattens that out a bit. You see? So if I bring that back to where it was. Now I can also change the low frequency and see what happens. That's making the peak a little bit more specific over that low region. It's very handy to know how this works. And if I bring up the attenuation of the low end as well, then we can just pretty much counteract that boost there, but with some interesting contour that you can see here. And that's what can make this plugin very interesting. Sorry, not this plugin, but this hardware, Pultec style. I'm going to leave it where we were there, and let's just go and have a look now. When I bring in for example, the waves plugin, I've got to turn off the hardware, otherwise I get both curves. Now, we'll bring this in, and to save time again, I've got a preset with the exact same settings that we just listened to. And if we look at that, we can immediately tell, right, that it's a very different curve. Just compare the two quickly, bypass that again, put the hardware on, take note of exactly that curve, bring it back. We can see, no wonder we're not getting the same sort of punch, because it's a more broadband boost up to about 4 all over the low range. We're getting fairly similar in the top end with our controls, but in the end it's a hugely different sound. So you cannot compare the two, the hardware and the software. At this point, it just doesn't make sense. It's not an adequate comparison. So let's have a look at the others. Bypass the waves one, have a look at this one. This is the Tube-Tec. I'll go to my preset, which is exactly the same settings we just listened to. Very similar to the waves plugin. In fact, it's not even as much on the low end, but still a very broadband boost rather than a peak at 48. And, you know, not at all having the same as the hardware. Bypass that, and then let's have a look at the Noble Q. Exact same settings again. And this one's a bit closer, I would say. You've got that slightly more peak, a little bit sharper curve on the low end, more accurate also in the high end. So there you go. It really is proof that by having the same settings, they're all different. Now, of course, that makes sense because these are algorithms, you know, a software engineer's design, and a hardware is circuitry and valves and capacitors and resistors. So, of course, we have a different way of achieving the curve for one thing, a different way of processing the sound. And, you know, it's very important to consider that. But what I've done now is I have created another preset where I played with the controls as best as I could for quite a long time to see if I could get the curve more resembling the hardware capture. I'm going to show you that one more time, the hardware capture. Let's put our hardware on. So that's the curve we're trying to model. Okay, now the best I could do with the waves was like this, and instead of having 60, for example, we've got 30 hertz boost, and you know, fairly similar settings, but we had to play around a little bit just to get it more accurate. So that's the one we've got for waves. Bypass that. For the puig-tec, let's have a look. We also went with the 30 hertz, so these two are very similar. And again, couldn't get it the same, it's not possible, but we did get more of a steep low end punch and a slightly less steep curve down here and a similar high end range. And the Noble Q, with a few more controls, got the closest to the hardware. We could really, if I go to the preset, that's really quite similar now, almost to 8 decibels at about 48, 50 hertz. Okay, so if we compare that just very quickly to the hardware one more time. Not the same, but much closer than it was before. So, if we now have a quick listen to, I'll turn off this Q capture device, put on my safety controls again. If we now go and put in that preset and compare, it will be much closer. And just for fun, what I've also done is I've brought in a FabFilter Pro Q set on natural phase to mimic or model as closely as I could this curve caught by the hardware. I'm just going to program that into the Q capture one more time so that we have that curve to look at again. Sorry. Put the hardware on, and then if I press hold, that'll keep the curve in there. That is the hardware. Okay. So we'll leave the hardware on. So as you can see here, these two curves quite similar, almost to 8 decibels here at 47 hertz. So yeah, I've put that in there so that we can see it really is about the curve that gets that sound. Okay, let's go ahead and have a listen to them all now. Starting with the hardware again to refresh our ears what it sounds like. So that's the hardware on, bypass, back on. Puig-tec, waves. Softube. PSP is on. Bypass and the hardware. And let's have a listen to our similar curve with the FabFilter. Go back to the hardware. Okay, interestingly, this was very similar. Now what we can do to further increase the accuracy is I'll use this cool plugin from NewGen Audio called Master Check, and I will match the levels of what we're doing here. So it'll be a bit quieter, but the levels will be matched. So now when I go and play between each one of these, we can match the level. Okay, Okay, so I don't expect you to be able to tell with the YouTube video anyway. I'm going to put some really good quality audio samples of each one of these. So the Pro Q2, each one of these EQs with a similar curve, and then you can really start comparing how they affect the sound. I'm obviously biased, but I love the hardware. I can always tell the difference. The low end seems to have less of a blanketed, muffled effect, and it's just more transparent. And that's obviously what you're paying for, the difference, that transparency. So to cap off, I can also use Q-Clone. If I bypass the other plugins, I can use my captured Q-Clone curve, which is what the hardware setting was. Hardware. So there you go. There's an insight into many different ways to compare these Pultec style EQs. It's up to you now. You can decide what you like best, if it's worth investing in the hardware, or if it's totally adequate for you to use a plugin, or perhaps with this technique you might even like using a standard EQ and getting a similar curve. But it's more of an insight. I have rambled on now for considerable time, so thanks for your attention. I do enjoy being thorough and talking about audio, so feel free to leave your comments in the YouTube video. I'll also put up some links for the audio samples for you to compare accurately in your own monitoring environment, because you can't really tell from a YouTube video. If you're interested in doing more learning, you can check out any of my courses on audiomasteringcourses.com or through our affiliate Loopmasters. And I do hope you can follow us on Facebook to keep up to date with mastering specials, and so yeah, just check out what's going on. Sometimes we're talking about interesting things there. So thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Nick Dombrain from Zeitgeist Mastering, and we'll catch you in the next video. Ciao.